So previously, we got up to the point where we used NSUser defaults to save our data. And then we created a data model that represented each and every to-do list item so that we can associate each item with not only just a title, but also whether if they have been done or not done. So this way, every single time we reload the table view, we'll always be able to correctly assign a check mark or no check mark to each and every to-do list item. Now, previously, where our app fell down was when we tried to save data that is of a custom data type to our to-do list. And the reason we mentioned was because we're using NSUser defaults, which can only take standard data types, not any custom types or custom objects that we have created. So in this lesson, we're going to address this by using a different method for saving our data and persisting it on the device. So the first thing that we need to do is to delete this print statement inside our app delegate did finish launching with the options so that we don't get confused between our print statements. And then we're going to go into our to-do list view controller and we're going to create a file path to the documents folder. So just after super.view did load, we're going to create a constant called data file path. And this is going to be set to equal file manager, which is an object that provides an interface to the file system. And then we're going to use the default file manager, which is a shared file manager object. So this, you should now recognize, is a singleton. And this singleton contains a whole bunch of URLs, and they're organized by directory and domain mask. So the search path directory we need to tap into is the document directory. Now be careful here, you're not looking for the documentation directory. That's something entirely different. We're looking for the document directory. So have a scroll through what other things you can tap into, and once you're done, go ahead and enter .document directory. And the location where we're going to look for it is inside the user domain mask. So this is the user's home directory, the place where we're going to save their personal items associated with this current app. And because this is an array, we're going to grab the first item, and then we're going to print this data file path. So let's go ahead and run our app and see what we get back. Now, if we have a look inside our debug console, we can see that we've got this optional printed, which doesn't really matter because we haven't unwrapped the optional URL, but this is what we want. This is the file path that we need. So let's go into Finder and navigate to this location. So if you want to navigate up the directory, you can always use Command Up button, and you can go up the hierarchy until you get to the root, which is your Macintosh hard drive. Now, starting from here, we're going to go into Users, then My Current User, which is Angela Yu, and then we're going to go into Library, and we're going to go into Developer, and inside Developer, we're going to go into Core Simulator, and we're going to look for the device that is 8D49. So you can always click on date modified so that it sorts by last open or last modified. So here we go, 8D49, and then inside data, inside containers, inside another folder called data, there's a folder called application, and we finally get to our application, which is this one, 53A. And you can see here we've got a plist that represents our NSUser defaults. Now, inside our app, instead of using NSUser default and grabbing that singleton and saving our data to that address, we're going to create our very own plist file. So all we need to do is go to the part where we created the file path to our documents directory, and then we just need to use the dot notation and tap into the appending path component method. And here we can add a path component. You can call it anything you want, but it's good to name it something that makes sense. For example, in this case, maybe we'll call it items.plist. Now, if I run the app and chase down that file path, and you'll see that we haven't yet got the items.plist. We've merely created a path to this new plist that we are going to create right now. So let's head back into Xcode. And let's modify our code. So instead of using user default, we're going to create our own plist at the location of our data file path. So the first thing that we have to change is this line where we set our item array for the key to-do list array into our user defaults. And because our item array is an array of our custom item object, then this line fails, and this is when our app crashes. Now, instead of doing this, so I'm just going to delete that line, I'm going to now create something called an encoder. And the encoder is going to be a new object of the type property list encoder. And I'm going to initialize it. Now what I can do is I can say let data equal encoder. So that's that property list encoder that I just created, which will encode our data, namely our item array, into a property list. So we're going to use our encoder, and we're going to use the method encode, and the value that we're going to encode is our item array. So once I hit enter, you'll see a couple of problems, namely that the encode method can throw an error. So we know what to do. We first have to create a do block, and then we need a catch block. And finally, we need to mark this method with a try. And because we are inside a closure, i.e. the part that gets triggered once the user presses the add item button, then we have to mark all our properties with a self. Now, once we've encoded our data, the next step is to write the data to our data file path. And this is also a method that can throw errors. So we have to mark it with a try also. So try data.write, so writing the data to a location. And the location is, of course, going to be our data file path. So in order for us to access it there, we have to put it out here as a global constant. And so now we can say data file path. And inside the catch block, we're going to print error encoding item array. And we're going to print out the error that triggered it. And finally, we have to mark this with a self because we are again inside a closure. So the last thing we have to do before this is going to work is we have to go into our item class, and we have to mark our class as conforming to the protocol's encodable. And this means that the item type is now able to encode itself into a plist or into a JSON. And for a class to be able to be encodable, all of its properties must have standard data types. So things like strings, booleans, arrays, dictionaries, they all work, but not if you have a custom class in here. So let's hit save, and let's fix that one last issue. And let's just comment out this line so that we can address it later. Now, if we run our app, let's see what happens. All right, so let's add a brand new item. So all three of these items got initialized because we hard-coded them and added them to the item array, which is what we're loading up inside our table view. Now, in order to test out our code and see if our encoding worked, we have to press the add button, and we're going to create a new item. And once I hit add item, you can see that I've got no errors. My debug console didn't pop up telling me that my app has crashed, and my app is continuing to work, and it now contains that brand new list item. So if we go back to Finder and check out that previous location that we found, but do you remember last time when we checked in here, there was nothing inside, it was completely empty? Well, now that we've actually saved something, but now that we've actually encoded our item array and wrote that data to that data file path, we now have this plist. And if we have a look at it by double clicking, you can see that we've got a whole bunch of items that have been organized and encoded automatically using our Swift encoder. Now, it's important to note at this point that previously, when we were talking about user defaults, and I explained why it is that we're unable to save an array of custom item objects, it's because the plist can only accept a limited number of data types, and they're pretty much the standard or foundation types. But if you take a look over here at our encoded items.plist, you can see that firstly, it's an array with 4 items, whereas user defaults is a dictionary or a bunch of key value pairs. And that's what we always said about user default. But if we expand this root, we can see that our encoder has very cleverly encoded each of the properties into a dictionary, and the individual properties still conform to all of the basic data types. And this is why, even though they're both plists, our items.plist is able to save our custom item objects, but the NSUser default is not. And it's all down to the encoder. And if I have this live next to my app, if I add another new item, that's really, really imaginative of me, you can see that it shows up here, but it also shows up here, right? But there's one bug. When we try to check our items off or uncheck it, this done property is not updated in our items.plist. So let's have a look at why that might be. So I'm going to stop the app and we're going to look at the part where we try to save that property. So you can see here, this is where we've got that delegate method did select row at index path. And inside this method, we toggle the item at the current index path, its done property, to the opposite of what it used to be. So this is only reflected inside our item array. So how can we save this information to our item.plist? Well, we have to use the same process, i.e. let encoder equals property list encoder, do encode the data, then try and write the data to that data file path, and if there's an error, print an error, and then reload the data. Now, instead of copying all of this and pasting it over there, this is a good time to think about creating a save data method. So let's go ahead and create a new function called save items underneath our IB action. And inside this function, we're going to copy all of this code. We're going to cut it and we're going to paste it inside save items. So now, because we're no longer inside a closure, we can get rid of these selfs in front of our item array and data file path. And we can also simply call save items, both when we add a new item using the alert controller, but also when we toggle the check mark. And we can delete this as well because it exists inside save items. So now let's hit run and see if our app works. And now if we check on the first cell, which is a find mic, you can see that this automatically updates inside our items.plist and all the changes are reflected live. But there's still a bit of an issue here. Namely, where are the items that we saved earlier on? Where's the save the world item? Where's the add a new item item? Why is it not showing up in our to-do list? Well, that's because even though we've written the saving part of the code, which encodes our item array, we haven't yet written the code to decode our items.plist in order to populate our table view. So that we're going to tackle on the next lesson.